Okay, so before we start today, I just wanted to say for the record that if you're clicking on this video expecting me to cover The Simpsons Hit and Run, you're barking up the wrong tree, unfortunately. Having played that game previously, I don't consider it a GTA-like game, retro or otherwise. I've always considered it a slightly non-linear driving game where the sandbox elements are slightly superfluous because there's very little to do in that game other than the mission path. That's just my take, and I won't speak on it further than that. But I just wanted to clarify that so it's not brought up. Also, I still want to get to 125k, so if you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe. There was a very long time when sandbox games were universally considered GTA clones or knockoffs, and I do take issue with that because I feel like the open world genre has such a broad and malleable concept, it's very easy to make an open world game with a distinct identity. I mean, if you want to tell me that Just Cause 2 and Red Faction Guerrilla are the same, you're out of your mind. But there is no doubt in my mind that there are GTA knockoffs out there, but they're a very distinct flavor. Not only do you have to be an open world game, you also have to be about a criminal underworld and have gameplay based around driving and shooting based around a linear sequence of missions. That's the essence of what we're looking for here, games that at the time were genuinely trying to ape GTA. These days, the genre has evolved to such an extent that there really is no such thing as a GTA clone anymore, which is why we're specifically going after what I consider the retro GTA clones. Games that came out between 2002 and 2010 thereabouts that were trying in some way to ape GTA. So let's not waste any more time, let's get to it with what some might consider the original GTA knockoff. True Crime Streets of LA. What is there to say about this game? Well, it was considered by some to be the original GTA clone. This was a 2003 game by the developer Luxaflux. Longtime followers of the channel will recognize them as the people who made both Vigilante 8 1 and 2, as well as Star Wars Demolition. In fact, driving around the game, you'll even see some advertisements for Vigilante 8 on the billboards, which is a neat little Easter egg. Less of a neat little Easter egg is the occasional advertisements for the brand called Jockstar, which is, for the more perceptive of you, a reference to Rockstar. Easter egg or penis envy? You decide. The plot of TCSOLA starts off about as cliched as you could possibly get. You play as Nick Kang, who's a tough cop who doesn't play by the rules, but he's the best damn cop there is, and he's paired up with a sassy, no-nonsense, by-the-book sort of lady who acts as the yin to his yang, which is fitting considering the overarching theme of karma in this game. And Nick is tasked with getting to the bottom of a counterfeit money laundering operation that starts out small but eventually graduates to involving corrupt cops, the Russian mob, and even the North Korean government. And this conspiracy will also lead Nick to the mystery surrounding the death of his father, who was also a high-ranking police officer. To me, this comes across as a really generic action movie. Everyone is some sort of character archetype, and the vast majority of the plot revolves around cool things happening, even if those cool things don't really make any sense. Which there's too much to go over in that regard, but let's take, for example, the plot point where Nick is fired from being a cop because he's gone too far. Well, this leads to a pretty cool scene where you have to get away from the cops, except resisting arrest as well as running over one of the police officers would have put him as a pretty high priority among the LAPD. It's just a cool moment that's not followed up upon. Or the fact that Nick drives away triumphantly when it's all said and done, despite the fact that he still broke a lot of laws and even blew up an airplane in the middle of the tarmac. And not to go all Mr. Enter on you guys, but this was 2003. That would probably be a bigger deal. And with everyone dead, there's no one left to explain Nick's side of the story, so by process of elimination, he would probably get blamed for all of this. Especially the dead cop, who also happened to be your dad's old partner who helped off him when your dad wouldn't play ball with the Russian mafia. The cops don't know that he was corrupt, and so with a dead cop among all the dead bodies and no good explanation why, Nick would probably take the fall for that. Also, Nick is a bit of an idiot because he falls for the "I'm totally trustworthy, here's where you need to go" gambit like 6 times. And he has so many opportunities to take out high-ranking villains, but never seems to take them, even though he's demonstrated himself to be a shoot-first, ask-questions-later style of cop. It's a bit frustrating, given the fact that this isn't even a very long game, but it still feels pretty dragged out. So yeah, it's definitely a style-over-substance game, but it's still fairly sober for most of it, but well, I still feel like I need to talk about this one episode. Just so we're clear, these strings of missions are considered episodes. Now, normally I like games that start out normal but gradually descend into madness, but this game descends into madness out of fucking nowhere. Like, you're investigating this Chinese restaurant and then suddenly you're in the kitchen fighting a zombie. Like, what? Then you go into a bunch of underground catacombs and fight more zombies. Then you meet this old master who throws things like flaming faces and an actual dragon at you. I'm sorry, wasn't this a crime drama a minute ago? Like, what the hell happened?
Come on, Nicholas. I'm only 342 years old.
And then things continue as normal, as if an earth-shattering break in reality didn't just happen. Although catacombs, monsters, and immortal monks under LA, yeah, that checks out. It's like that cliche about how the door to hell is in LA. I mean, it just fits. One thing I will say I absolutely appreciate about this game is that it implements two separate what-if story paths, and these are fairly elaborate story paths, even though they're only a few missions each. The one I played is a divergent story during a pivotal moment about halfway through the game where your brother gets kidnapped, and in this storyline, Nick's brother is killed where in the main story he survived. And in the scenario where the brother is killed, it leads to this interesting side story of Nick becoming disenfranchised with the cops and basically becoming a full-tilt vigilante, which is not a bad storyline. Well, not bad for this game anyway, because it still suffers from the same issues the rest of the story suffers from, but I appreciate the effort nonetheless. Once you get into the game, it's a fairly competent sandbox game. I'm pretty sure it's a fairly accurate recreation of the Los Angeles metropolitan area. I'm not sure how accurate, but if it isn't accurate, I couldn't tell. And of course, this is a standard GTA-style sandbox where you have linear missions that you need to do, but you can activate them whenever you feel like it. In the meantime, you can play around the sandbox. Though it's not exactly the most reactive or varied sandbox. There are a few side activities you can do, but it doesn't really take advantage of the sandbox element to the greatest effect it can. The biggest way they take advantage of the sandbox is that as you drive around, random crimes will happen and you get bonus points for helping out with them between the main missions. And I know we can joke about hurdy-dur, isn't LA filled with so much crime, but Jesus Christ, there is a lot of crime going on in this game. It's like every 10 seconds, except when I really need to find a crime, there's some sort of street fight or shootout with the cops. And it always makes me chuckle to see how willing certain criminals are to just keep breaking the law even after they've been caught. Like, there were times when I straight up destroyed someone's car with bullets only for them to get out, surrender, then immediately jack another car and keep going. At one point I saw someone jack different cars like 5 times in a row and I would destroy each one sequentially. And it amazes me as well just how many people will attack a police officer on sight or are so gung-ho to shoot a police officer the moment his gun is drawn. Now, I haven't interacted with many criminals since high school, and that's not a joke by the way. My school had a last chance program for criminal youth, and they were some of the nicest people you'll ever meet as long as you were on their good side. But if you're dealing with people doing petty crimes like street racing or having a fist fight in the middle of a street, normally once the police show up, that's the end of it. But these people will actively throw their lives away by punching you on sight, and some even pull out guns, turning a misdemeanor into a lifelong sentence. I'm not complaining, I just think that's funny. Although what I will complain about is the traffic. It's overly aggressive, meaning that half the time if you're fighting someone on the street and try to arrest them, there's a 50-50 chance you'll be run over. Which I wouldn't normally care about, but this is a game with a heavy hand-to-hand element, so you're going to be backing up onto the street quite a lot. Plus, you're also a cop. You'd think that even people in LA would be reasonable enough to not try and run over a guy while he's trying to arrest someone, but what do I know? On a side note, it's also funny to me that you have all these crimes going on, and yet it seems like Nick is the only one going around to try and do anything about them. Shouldn't there be other cops on the road to handle things other than you, and aren't you a detective? Don't you have better things to do? You know, this must be a satirical dig at what happens if you defund the police. The whole crime stoppage thing builds into the game's biggest unique selling point, the karma system. Basically, if you're a good cop, you'll get good karma points, and if you're a bad cop, you'll get negative karma points. And if you, for example, handle criminals improperly or run over people too many times, you'll get too many negative karma points, and you won't be able to access certain parts of the story until you get back to a positive level. The idea is, you can do whatever you want, but it's at your own risk. You don't need to be a cop at all. You can just be a straight-up criminal. Hence why this is a GTA clone. Now, there's also this badge currency stuff, which you earn for doing tasks and can be spent on vehicle repairs and health. I think it's unrelated to the karma system, but is earned in the same way. So you basically have to do tasks to earn the currency to get yourself back up to tip-top shape. However, you wouldn't need to get back up to tip-top shape if you weren't doing tasks. So what's the purpose? Well, you need enough positive karma as a buffer so that when mistakes happen, it won't put you into the negatives. So risking your health and time for positive karma does give this a risk-reward factor. But it's also worth mentioning that the risk-reward of the karma is only in theory because I was just tokenly being careful with not running over civilians and I found myself never having negative karma. So it's a decent idea but not super intrusive. What is intrusive, however, are the controls. The default controls in this game are a bit unusual, but they do offer a different preset that's more akin to GTA. However, what the game doesn't tell you is that certain commands like arresting people or showing your badge are reliant on certain button combinations, like arresting someone is the reload button and the grapple button at the same time, which is normally R2 and circle. With that said, however, it's not always R2 and circle. If you change the reload to something else, it'll be that button instead. Which means that if you decide to change the controls up at all, you'll have to be mindful of which commands are the default and which commands correspond to those commands in the current setup so you can figure out which button combinations to press in order to do what you need to do. It's really confusing, especially because the game doesn't have a tutorial. It just kind of throws you into the action sight unseen. I mean, it does have a tutorial in theory, but it only shows you how to shoot, which is a pretty brain-dead mechanic, all things considered. A lack of a tutorial wouldn't be so bad if there weren't important things the game doesn't tell you. I had to go into the manual to learn about the more arcane button commands, and if you're not going to give us a tutorial, at the very least you could give us an on-screen indicator. When I first played this game, I tried playing with more GTA-esque controls, but after wrestling with them for an hour and trying to figure out what the button commands were, I basically gave up, because I kept accidentally punching civilians when I was trying to arrest them, which is, you know, fairly minor in the grand scheme of things if you're an American cop, but never mind. But all that is just as well, because the hand-to-hand combat is probably the game's most unique selling point. Sandbox games tend to neglect hand-to-hand combat in favor of gunplay, but this is actually very elaborate. As a matter of fact, there are several dojos around the city that you can go to train yourself up. You have blocks, multiple attack buttons, grapples, and a system wherein if you hit enough uninterrupted strikes, you can do a super combo, which is pretty cool. Unfortunately, I seem to have broken the combat engine just by alternating between pressing the X and square buttons. Even the final boss went down to that eventually. So it's an elaborate system with a lot of unlockable attacks that can unfortunately be cheesed. But if you're willing to learn the more intricate aspects of the combat engine, it's fairly fun to play. Plus, I can't get enough of that HUD. Take a look at Nick's health indicator. As a friend put it, he looks like a coworker just insisted on showing him a funny internet video that Nick thinks is about as funny as a hernia. But he's obliged to sit there until it's over. Sorry, went on a bit of a tangent there. They also punctuate a lot of the hand-to-hand combat with the soundtrack. I remember I was just casually playing through one of the scenarios when I noticed that the backing track was Peace Sells. God damn, that's pretty sweet. If you're into Megadeth. Yeah, cards on the table, as big of a metalhead as I am, you know, Megadeth, I've never really been into it. For me, good music of all varieties requires good vocals, and Dave Mustaine has never been a good singer. The rest of the soundtrack is honestly filled with a bunch of bangers, both contemporary and old school. But I never even heard half the music, because whenever you get into a car it plays a random track, so a lot of the music gets swept under the rug, and this, my friends, is why GTA has radio stations. One of the artists included on this soundtrack is Snoop Dogg, and apparently you can even unlock Snoop Dogg as a playable character, and man, what I wouldn't give to just casually be included in a game like that. Kinda like how Fred Durst is just a playable character in a bunch of games due to his own contractual negotiations. I don't like Limp Bizkit, another case of potentially good music ruined by a subpar singer, but I respect that. The shooting, meanwhile, in this game is fairly brain dead. I guess they were still trying to figure out this sort of thing, but basically you have unlimited ammo and you can reload at any time, and while this is a bit slow, it automatically locks onto whatever targets are within a certain distance. And I'm not gonna lie, this is the most run and gunny of all the games I've played recently, and it's very easy to get through without dying once just by strafing and mashing the shoot button, which is normally mapped to R1, which isn't the most convenient button to mash, especially when you want to hold down the accelerate button and steer at the same time, but still, I didn't have any issues, mostly. Just as long as you stay mobile and occasionally take cover, you'll do fine. The stealth is mostly just as easy, especially because you're given a good window of opportunity between being seen and getting caught. Even if it is the type of stealth that instantly sends you back to the checkpoint if you fail, but between the instant knockout attack to alerted enemies and the tranquilizer bullets you get, it's really not much of a challenge, so long as you take your time. And that just leaves us with the driving, and in fairness, the driving is pretty damn good. It's not quite as heavy as another game we'll be covering in a bit, but it's still fairly weighty and present. It's still enough of a challenge to get through the game with the physics in question, plus they utilize the driving well. Even if the missions do get a bit repetitive in that regard after a certain point, there are quite a few tailing missions, there are quite a few chase missions, and there are quite a few getaway missions. So if you're not a fan of that dish, well, eat up anyway. Although it's worth doing the race challenges as often as you can. Quick explanation, if you fail a mission, you can skip to the next one, but then you lose access to some later missions. With that said, if you complete every mission within an episode, you get the opportunity to get a bonus. Either a car, a fighting move, or a gun. You can survive pretty well with the default amount of hand-to-hand combos or guns. The only thing I felt was useful with the hand-to-hand combat was when I unlocked an elbow drop to downed enemies. There was one point when I had incomplete missions involving having to drive somewhere really fast, and the game put me into the most recent car I was in, which just so happened to be a money van. Not exactly very fast. So I basically had to quit out and do the very hard bonus missions to unlock faster cars. Using the fastest car in the game, I beat the previously impossible challenges without much challenge at all. It's a game that doesn't really do instant gratification all that much because there are certain roadblocks built in where you have to grind in order to get past them, and admittedly, I don't like the idea of forcing a big fat roadblock on you at the 11th hour if you don't get through every single main mission. But if you have more time than me, the game's fun enough that the extra grinding and extra side content can be pretty compelling. And if you don't have time, there's always the cheat codes. Overall, I think True Crime Streets of LA is a decent GTA clone. It does some things different. It's not quite as open, but for what it is, it's a decent enough time. And even if you don't enjoy it all that much, at the very least, it's not very long. So it won't cost you too much of your precious time. Not the best sandbox game I've ever played, but far from the worst as well. But it still doesn't earn the distinction of subverting the GTA clone stigma. Not gonna lie guys, it's been a very long time since I felt this defeated by a game. So as you know, I like to emulate my games and upscale them to 1080p because, I don't know, I think it looks better. Unfortunately, True Crime New York City is one of those games where there's no good option for emulation if you decide to emulate and upscale it. On the PS2 version, you have that weirdly flickery shadow in the middle distance. This is a common thing with PS2 emulation where if you upscale a game, it presents graphical artifacting that's not there if you play it in standard resolution. The GameCube version, widely known as the inferior port, has frame rate issues and also control issues from not having enough inputs, but that's besides the point. And the Xbox version has the same frame rate issues that the GameCube version has, except it also has no widescreen option. So I went to my audience and asked them what they would prefer, and the overwhelming majority said the PS2 version at a standard resolution. Fair enough. Unfortunately, that wasn't where my troubles ended because things went off without a hitch for a while, but after a certain point, this game became a game of glitch minesweeper, where I felt like I had to save state every 10 seconds because I wasn't sure when the game was gonna crash next. Eventually, I realized I could fix this by switching to software rendering, but even then, the game still had one final nut punch in store for me. There's this one mission called Safe House where you have to infiltrate, well, a safe house. Unfortunately, no matter how many times I tried to start this mission, the same thing would happen. It would start, none of the textures would load in, and I would fall to my death, rinse and repeat. Unfortunately, I actually had to download a save file from the internet, and evidently this is a known issue because one of the default save files that I could download placed a save point directly after this mission. Which, for the record, I turbo appreciate. Unfortunately, this save file also had all the upgrades and many thousands of dollars in the bank, so unfortunately I missed out on doing much of the side content, but after all the trouble I went through to play this game, I'll take it. So True Crime New York City is unrelated to Streets of LA. It came out in 2005 and stars this guy Marcus Reed. The game starts in medias res, with Marcus badly wounded going to a slum to take out some rival gang members who betrayed him and his dad. And once that's over, Marcus is then met by his dad's oldest friend and a pseudo-father figure for Marcus named Terry, who's a detective for one of the branches of the NYPD. He covers for Marcus after his rampage, and then we cut to 5 years later when Marcus is reformed and is now a cop who's just been promoted to an organized crime unit and is partnered with Terry. After only a few short minutes, I realized I already liked Marcus more than I liked Nick from the other game. Marcus has a more relatable story of a criminal who fell into a life of crime because it was his only means of survival, but is still ultimately good at heart. So he's able to be the best version of himself once he's given the opportunity, and that's where the main plotline begins. However, the moment I saw how caring Terry was to Marcus, I knew that he was either gonna die or betray you, and as a matter of fact, we get our answer very quickly. Much quicker than I anticipated. What struck me first was just how many big-name actors showed up for the game. You have Lawrence Fishburne, Mickey Rourke, Christopher Walken, all of which play characters that don't show up all that much, presumably to try and keep the budget reasonable.
Reminds me of the time I was in Vietnam. There was this girl. Anyway, I got my mole, you got Terry's killer.
And it's situations like this where I feel bad for the main voice actor, in this case Avery Kid Waddell, because he carries the game.
What the hell happened, Marcus? They tried to murk me too. Motherfuckers with no loyalty don't deserve to live.
There is such a palpable authenticity to how he portrays the character that grounds the game in a level of realism that makes it easy to get invested in the story. But you just know that he was getting paid a fraction of what the other guys were getting paid because he's a career voice actor and not a Hollywood actor. I wish career voice actors would get more respect. Though I want to make special mention of this guy in the insane asylum level.
Going wrong? Seek will help. Seek knows this place.
I didn't think he was famous, but I did recognize the voice. Then I realized, that's Beetlejuice, the guy from the Howard Stern show who got hit over the head with a guitar by Jeff Jarrett that one time. What an oddly deep cut. Now, while the previous game was a generic action movie, this is more or less a generic cop drama. A rookie detective with a dark past has to get to the bottom of the death of his father figure, which leads him to this multi-layered criminal conspiracy with multiple gangs working in tandem with a mysterious person at the top, which leads to a corruption case in the police force. Yeah, I've seen this story before, and the ending plot twist is a predictable one because in any cop drama, when there's a character who doesn't like the main character, it's almost always certainly a red herring. When it comes to the structure of the story, I'd say it plays off the investigative structure of this style of game a lot better than Streets of LA, because in that game it was a linear series of missions that was long and tedious because they had to stretch out one singular goal over 8 hours. Whereas this game has it to where after a certain point you have several different leads that you can pursue in whatever order you want, and each will lead you on a mission path that will in some way help to the overall investigation. So rather than having one singular long narrative, you have several side narratives that all converge into a single point, which is a fairly unique way to do a story like this, and it keeps you guessing. With that said, however, there was one absolutely egregious plot contrivance in the end. I'll try to say it without spoilers. Basically, the real main villain reveals himself to Marcus and expects Marcus to go along with the main villain's plans, despite the fact that nothing up until now has shown that Marcus is willing to budge on his morals. And if the main villain just slipped away into the darkness without confronting Marcus, he would have gotten away scot-free. There are possible explanations to that, but I couldn't talk about those explanations without spoiling, so I'll just move on. Overall, I think the game's story is better structured and better paced than the first game, and the investigation leading you to multiple gangs leads to a lot more variety in the setting and plot ideas, which I really like. And it's carried by a really likable main character with a solid personality and a backstory that inherently makes you want to root for him. I still think it's a generic cop drama overall, but a good generic cop drama. As for the gameplay, what is there to say about NYC that I haven't already said about LA? Well, aside from the issues I faced while trying to emulate the game, to me, it's odd that this game was as poorly received as it was. Yeah, it got significantly lower scores than the previous game, and I'm not sure if it really deserves that. Sure, it streamlined things somewhat by mostly eliminating the stealth gameplay, but the stealth gameplay wasn't exactly deep enough in its own right that it feels like much of a loss. I mean, there are a few pseudo-stealth segments, but half the time I got spotted by the first enemy anyways, and a gunfight is easier and quicker than sneaking through. Otherwise, I didn't notice a single significant way that this game differs quality-wise from the first. Maybe I'm wrong, I'm not always the most perceptive to this sort of thing, but it feels pretty much identical in a lot of ways. And in other ways, a lot better, quite frankly. It's a series of relatively linear story missions that you can tackle at any time, and meanwhile, as you drive through the street, you can solve random crimes. And that's actually been fairly expanded upon. This time, instead of simply having non-violent and violent criminals, you have an in-between level of semi-violent criminals who you can beat up with impunity, but if you shoot them, your bad cop rating will go up. But otherwise, you have several more varieties of criminal cases to handle, many of which involve going into a building, and I actually find it very interesting that they modeled the building's interiors for a lot of these areas specifically for this purpose. Going the extra mile like this always makes the game world feel more layered. Plus, there's no shortage of driving and street-level based crimes to deal with, so you get a good mix of old and new. And these missions are actually a lot more consequential now for multiple reasons. First of all, in the various boroughs of New York, you can actually do a certain amount of crime stoppages in order to clean up that part of the town, which will work towards your 100% completion. So you have more of a reason to do them other than just getting your rating up this time around, which is funny because you already have more of a reason to begin with, because whether or not you're a good cop or bad cop determines which ending you get. And they actually make it harder to be a good cop than a bad cop in ways that's more than just it being easy to blow people to kingdom come. Which I feel is an intelligent but possibly unintentional statement on human nature, how it's so much easier to be a bad person than a good person. The way they do this is, first of all, you have an evidence system this time around wherein during crime scenes and a few side missions you can collect evidence and you can either turn it into the police to increase your good cop rating or you can sell it. But the thing is, selling things to the black market is your easiest way to make money, and you need money to buy better cars to make the game easier, and the amount of money you get from your salary is a pittance comparatively. So this game actually makes it hard to be the good guy, which makes the inclusion of the mechanics so much more compelling. Though I will say it is sometimes hard to be a good cop even if you are trying, considering that while you're chasing criminals, if you're pointing in any way towards the sidewalk while you're driving, civilians will attempt to jump out of the way but will end up jumping right into your bumper, and I can hardly be blamed for running someone over in that case. Or at least that's what I told the judge. But I guess that just builds into the difficulties of being a good cop even more, though this is balanced a bit. Whether intentional or not, they've made it somewhat easier to arrest violent criminals with guns. You'll usually take a few hits, but if you just run and then dive at them, you'll get a grapple off which forcefully drops the gun, which means you can just beat them up like a regular enemy and then arrest them once they're on the ground. And this is considered the correct and moral way to do it. You can even do that to people legally acting in self-defense, like these security guards in the museum. You're the one who broke in, and as far as they know, they're just preventing someone from trespassing, but you can just straight up arrest them, which I find very funny in a cosmic sort of way. You can just arrest people for doing their jobs. So the ease of arresting violent criminals is one of the gimmies the game gives you, and there are other gimmies as well. Like whenever you're set to interrogate someone, you're obliged to do this minigame where you have to align the intimidation line correctly, and when it's all said and done, you can knock them out, kill them, or arrest them. And unless you're deliberately doing an evil run, arresting them means free points. Also, in many of these situations, you can also choose to immediately interrogate the perp or beat them up first, which will give you bad cop points. Which I accidentally did at one point, not realizing the perp had surrendered, and my god, out of context, this looks awful. Matter of fact, it doesn't look much better in context either. Though either way, the points you earn builds into your experience, which will then earn you promotions after a while, which will then unlock various upgrades and whatnot, as well as give you a raise. Which means that even if you don't necessarily want to engage in the side activities, the game encourages you to, in that the more you do, the easier the game gets, even if it is already pretty easy. The combat, for example, is really streamlined. It's seemingly slower than the previous game, but I find that the engine is much more refined than the previous game. There were a lot of toys you could play around with in Streets of LA, but it kind of made the combat feel a little bit messy at times, whereas in this case, they pared the combat down to the essential maneuvers. But they also made it crunchy as hell. Man, laying into your opponents just feels great in this game. And something about just running and tackling somebody and then smashing their face into the ground is so satisfying. Probably in a way that indicates I should seek help. Though there is one specific way to cheese the melee combat, and that's the spinning kick. It will immediately knock down every enemy in your way and give you a chance to grab them on the ground or just kick them. Even most bosses go down to this like it's nothing. The only drawback is that the spinning kick does use a lot of stamina, but even if you run out of stamina, you can get it back almost immediately, so it's not a big deal. Like in the previous game, you have different styles of attack you can pull off, and even the occasional stun move that you can pull off, but regardless of the context or the abilities, X and Square still does the spin kick, and that's all you really need to know. Unfortunately, unless it's an emulation issue, the theoretically banger tracks during fight scenes have been omitted this time around, even though there is a good soundtrack for this game. You can even choose your favorite tracks and prioritize certain tracks in order to optimize the playlist to your preferences. Something I wish the previous game did, although my preferences in these games are usually metal and punk, but there's not much to the soundtrack that I really recognize other than White Zombie, the predecessor to Rob Zombie, and as I've said before, I haven't been a fan of Rob Zombie in his various works in a while. But at the very least I know what it is, though it surprises me given how endemic he was to gaming soundtracks at the time that they didn't include one of his top 5 hits. Fun fact, by the way, what I would argue are all 5 of Rob Zombie's most well-known songs were actually from the same album, Hillbilly Deluxe. Yeah, Dragula, Super Beast, Living Dead Girl, Demonoid Phenomenon, and Meet the Creeper were all on the same album. And at time of writing, 3 of those songs are his top 3 on Spotify by a significant margin. I have no point to make here, I just find it funny that given how endemic Rob Zombie was to the metal scene for a while, I expected his hits to be more spread out, but no. Honestly, when it came to the soundtrack, I was a little bit more into the rap, strangely enough. I mean, I had to fiddle with the game's settings for like 20 minutes when I first started, so that Welcome to New York City song now has a rent-free penthouse apartment in my head. Though in fairness, Jay-Z is a legend, but you don't need me to tell you that. Also, Rapper's Delight. It was funny to hear that song in this game. To be clear, I love Rapper's Delight. As a non-rap fan, I'd imagine it's one of the more normie opinions, but I don't care, I just love the upbeat energy of that song. Why I find it funny is because it's like a 13-minute song, and yet you're never in the car long enough for the whole song to play out. But at the very least, it's better than licensing the song for Thrasher Skate and Destroy. I mean, that's a game where each gameplay run is like 1 minute, so you barely even have enough time to get to the lyrics, let alone the majority of the song in that case. At least in a driving game like this, it makes more sense. Although it's worth mentioning that they seem to be using a 4-minute version of the song. Incidentally, as far as the driving mechanics in this game, they weren't noticeably different enough for me to be able to comment on it. It's not noticeably better or worse than the previous game, and I'm okay with that. With that said, how's the gun combat? Well, you can tell that the evolution of shooting mechanics in console games evolved a lot in the 2 short years between the 2 games, because in Streets of LA, you had an auto lock-on function. This time, the aiming is all manual all the time, which I actually prefer because it means that you have more agency over who you're aiming at. While the aiming in LA was decent, there were occasions where you wouldn't aim where you wanted, costing you valuable health. But now it's mostly up to your skill. However, with these glorified turret sections, I wish the game would have auto-aimed for me because even when I'm hitting enemies, half the time their health doesn't go down. So I kinda wish the game would just aim for me if it's that fickle. Otherwise, I appreciate the overhaul to the shooting, and even if you're bad at shooting, you have other options, such as a Max Payne style slow motion dive or the precision mode, which you honestly get so much of, you might as well have unlimited amounts. And you know what's funny about all these various mechanics you have? They actually go out of their way to teach them to you in a multi-part tutorial. Imagine that. So no players are left in the dark, nor do they have to consult with the manual or whatever else. Even then, the UI is better designed, so you contextually know what to do at various times. And honestly, I think what really sells the experience overall to me is the game world. From what I understand, this is an almost exact 1-to-1 scale model of Manhattan. A couple of years before GTA 4 did exactly that, and for some reason I find that this city is so much more well realized than LA was in the previous game. Something about it feels so authentic in ways that I can't really describe. I would say it really nails the big city atmosphere. When you put together the scale model of the city and combine it with the weather effects and the civilians and all the various other touches they put in, something about it just feels so textured in the presentation, where LA just felt lifeless and empty. There's still a little bit too much travel in the sense that the city is huge, and a lot of missions are based in complete other sides of the city, but then this game also has an unmentioned taxi element where you can just travel via taxi to wherever you need to go. And they also have subways as well, giving you 2 different types of fast travel. I'm not sure if Streets of LA had the same thing, but if it did, I wish it was more obvious. It's crazy to me because the more I look at this game, the more things I find to like. I mean, it doesn't quite get as ridiculous as the previous game, which might turn some people off. I guess there is the possibility that people look towards this series for a cop drama sprinkled with a bit of stupidity, but there is still some weirdness here and there. Such as the aforementioned insane asylum level with the really unintuitive level design, this massive underground cavern with a Chinese kung fu master you have to fight, or the level where you have to fight the reincarnation of Yasuke. So I don't know what exactly it is that made this game a critical and commercial failure. I think it's a game that makes Streets of LA look like a proof of concept, because this is just so much more well realized. So I want to know what you guys think. What is it that makes this game worse than the first? Because so far, I'm not convinced. Mafia is probably the most interesting case out of all these games because while its release date was after GTA 3, it was only by about 10 months. And it had been in development since 1998, but it also changed direction and even game engines, but the similarities to GTA are undeniable. I mean, the controls are basically identical, so whether this was a big coincidence or whether the design philosophies shifted heavily in the 10 months leading up to the game going gold, I don't know. But I'm only playing with the cards I'm dealt. This is a game by Illusion Softworks, a Czech developer that more or less flew under the radar until these games came out, at which point Mafia would become their biggest franchise right up until they got shut down in 2017 after Mafia 3 didn't do so well. As for the first in the Mafia franchise, it's a janky but compelling affair. It starts off in 1930 in Lost Heaven, Illinois, a fictional city that couldn't be more based off Chicago if they tried, where an Italian-American immigrant, Tommy Angelo, is working as a taxi driver but is in the wrong place at the wrong time, or perhaps the right place at the right time depending on your perspective, and is forced to drive a couple of Italian mobsters belonging to the Salieri crime family. He's then given an offer to join them, and he's initially hesitant and decides to go back to his life as a taxi driver, only for the choice to be made for him when a rival mafia family attacks him, which symbolically ends his normal civilian life as a taxi driver because the company fires him for being involved with the mafia even though he isn't at this point. So he essentially is forced to begin working with the Salieri crime family out of a means for survival, and I don't even need to have played the rest of the game to predict the rest of the plot. We're gonna go through a series of crime-based missions that gradually escalate until there's some sort of major mistake that either gets the main character in trouble with the police or with the rest of the crime family. And him and his friends are gradually killed off or arrested, and there's probably also going to be a major betrayal in there somewhere, and yeah, that's pretty much the case. My only surprise was when everything eventually came crashing down, Tommy actually willingly testified against his own mafia family, which breaks Rule 1 of the mafia's unwritten rules, otherwise known as Omerta. This actually sets up the framing device for the game, which actually is a pretty clever framing device, having the entire game be a series of flashbacks while Tommy is testifying to a detective. Standard plot progression aside, I actually quite like the story. It's well presented, and I like Tommy as sort of a put-upon-everyman who's forced into this impossible situation, and he's gradually forced deeper and deeper until the inevitable downfall happens. On more than one occasion, he lets someone go after being explicitly instructed to kill them, even if it means putting his own ass on the line. In fact, part of what causes his downfall is first of all his conscience, and second of all, the fact that he was a normal guy and not a born and bred mobster. He didn't have the heart for it, especially once he had a family. Like, there's this really poignant scene early on where he has a conversation with a priest after shooting up a church where he feels remorseful about what's going on, and the priest tries to appeal to his spirituality.
This is terrible. Don't you know murder is the greatest sin?
I know, Father. But somehow everything got fouled up. I made a mistake somewhere.
But what about you? You can look yourself in the face? Your hands are stained with blood that you'll never wash off.
I know that, Father.
And what really sells it is the top-notch performances by the likes of Michael Sorvino, William DeMeo, and George Ticenzo. The only knock I have against the story is the fact that despite Tommy's wife and eventually child playing a big role into his character arc, we never actually see them. Like, we only see Sarah, his eventual wife, once when they first meet. After that, it's mentioned in an offhanded narration that they got married, but we never see her otherwise. Still, I think this is a fantastically told story. As for the rest of the game, it's a very weird one. You can tell it was made before the sandbox genre was standardized because, while it's a lot like GTA 3, it does have some interesting differences. Most notably the fact that despite being an open world, the game is essentially linear. You have an entire city you can drive around as you wish, a few really overlong side missions, and you even have a free roam mode. But when you're in the story mode, every time you finish your mission, the next mission is automatically activated, so it's a game that really psychotically holds onto its pacing, which isn't necessarily a good thing because the pacing can be all over the place at times. Like how after the fast start with the chase mission, you immediately find yourself in a mission where you have to do 5 taxi fares in a row. And these are not short taxi fares. You have to drive across the city for pretty much each one of them. This takes just shy of forever. Plus, not to mention that each one of these taxi fares has a time limit, meaning that if you fail one, you have to do the entire mission again. I would imagine. I never actually failed one of them. So this is really only a sandbox game in the sense that you have an open world, but it's an open world specifically designed with linearity in mind. And you play by their rules or you don't play by any rules at all. It's unique certainly, and let's be honest, the mission path is usually the best part in most of the GTA games and GTA style games because that's where you get the most deliberately structured content. And I'm down with that as long as the game plays well, and to be fair, the driving is pretty excellent in this game. They basically went for driving as realistic as they possibly could for the time. The cars feel incredibly heavy. They take a while to speed up and slow down, which makes turning at high speeds nigh impossible, and they get wrecked pretty easily. Matter of fact, you take damage for every crash you get into, and you'll need every bit of health you can get for some of these levels. Plus, unlike in GTA games where you have to be committing a felony in the line of sight of a police officer to get a wanted level, the police in this game are actually a lot more observant. They'll get you for speeding, get you for running a red light, and any number of other minor offenses. The police chases are a bit obnoxious at times though, because some of these police cruisers are nearly impossible to get away from. And if you're being pursued for long enough, you have to deal with an elongated period of being wanted by the police where every single cop in the city knows your exact location. And seeing as you're always in the missions, this does nothing but interrupt the flow, but at the very least it makes for a unique experience, and I will admit that getting away from a speeding ticket by speeding is quite satisfying. Honestly, I feel like if this game was just a driving game, it would probably be a pretty high quality one. It would probably get old after a couple hours, but that's where the quality lies, because everything else is janky as hell. I mean, just to look at this on-foot segment. I don't even think I need to describe it, just look at it. It looks like an alpha build. And it feels like an alpha build as well, because every time you have to exit the car to do anything, the game takes a serious downturn in quality. Especially if it involves shooting, because the shooting in this game is among some of the worst I've ever experienced. First of all, I believe the enemies have hit scan weapons, meaning that regardless of distance or weapon type, if they're pointing at you, there's a good chance their shots will hit. So more than once I got absolutely mangled by enemies I couldn't even see and had no frame of reference for where they were. This was especially bad in the more open areas, in which case enemies could have been shooting at you from any number of directions. There's one level in this airport where at one point I was actually searching all around because I could not find where the mission objective or any of the enemies were. Level Design 101. If you have an open level, you need to be able to organically herd the player towards where you intend them to go. Otherwise, you can't blame them for wandering. And even in the more claustrophobic environments where you at least know where the enemies are, it's still bad because on one hand they can drain your health bar in a second, and on the other hand it's almost impossible to prepare yourself for a gunfight because in most cases there's no way to prevent yourself from being shot at if you're aiming at someone. Because if you're able to shoot them, they're able to shoot you. I found that the only way to protect myself from being shot at was to catch enemies just barely around a corner so I could shoot their shoulder or something. But I was technically not in their line of sight, which basically means the only way to win at this game is to subvert the game's mechanics rather than use them as intended. But even that wasn't a guarantee, and on console, the aiming reticle is unreasonably sensitive. So most of these fights can be described by taking the absolute smallest peaks out of a corner for shot after shot, but probably still being killed anyway. And if not, the overly sensitive reticle will leave you wasting ammo. Not that it matters, because you can waste ammo just by reloading. I don't know how this was overlooked, or more to the point, how they thought it was a good idea, but this is some of the most amateurish game design I've ever seen in a professional product. I was wondering how I was going through so much Tommy gun ammo, but you see, after most gunfights I reflexively reloaded my gun because I like to have a full clip. But if you reload at any point before your clip is empty, the remaining ammo in that clip will be lost forever. So say you have 200 Tommy gun bullets and a clip with 40 bullets left. If you reload the clip, instead of having a full clip of 50 and then 190 bullets in your inventory, you will lose the 40 extra bullets, so you will only have 150 left instead of 190. I don't know if this was a deliberate choice or just poor design, but I hate it either way. There isn't a single enjoyable gunfight in this entire game, and I will admit with absolutely no shame whatsoever that I was save stating like a bitch for half these segments because I refused to have to do entire segments over due to their own poor difficulty balancing and game design. It doesn't help that for every level you're given exactly one full health bar. So for example, if you lose any health on the drive over to a destination, you will have to deal with that little bit of health loss for the rest of the mission. Most linear missions have a few health pickups you can find, but some missions are entirely in the city and there are no healing items in the city save for a few major landmarks. Unfortunately, you can only use them once per mission, so for example, during the bank robbery mission, we have to get weapons and a car, but during that period of time, I found myself with quite a significant chunk of health lost by the time I got to the bank. So I basically had to brute force this bank heist with almost no health. Like, if a mission has several mid-mission save points, why not just restore your health at the save points? Because we're forced to continue from that point if we die, and we start with the exact same amount of health we had anyway. That is, unless we want to restart the mission, which could be upwards of 20 to 30 minutes of progress lost. All for the sin of not having an absolutely perfect run and having the maximum health. It's complete crap.
What a load of bullshit.
Ultimately though, for me the killing blow for the game is the fact that it's so overlong. It doesn't even have that many missions. It only has like 21 in total, but most of them are relentlessly dragged out to breaking point. Like take for example the mission just for relaxation. It's one of the final missions, but you have to sneak up to this dockyard and distract one of the dockyard managers in order to steal a specific shipment of crates. But get this, you need to painstakingly grab every single box and put them into the truck. It won't even register if you're on the wrong side of the truck. You see, normally these days, menial tasks like this have it to where the game will fade out and then fade back in where you've already done the task. What's even worse is when you're distracting the manager, he never seems to be gone long enough, so regardless of if you distract him or not, you still have to fight anyway. That's just one example of padding, but quite frankly, I feel as though it's indicative of the entire experience. I've already mentioned the taxi fare mission Running Man, but almost every mission in the game begins with a horribly drawn out driving sequence, where for one reason or another they have you drive all the way across the city and sometimes even across the city multiple times. It just feels like padding is all. When a mission takes 30 minutes but 20 of those minutes are just getting to where the action is, I can't help but be bored. The absolute most egregious example of an overlong mission is the mission called You Lucky Bastard. I have to pay my respects to this mission because holy hell, it is no joke, a 4-part mission with one single objective that you fail at within story context multiple times. You have to knock off Sergio Morello Jr., so you have to go to a restaurant and try to kill him, but he's not there and you accidentally kill an innocent person. You have to get to his house to plant a car bomb, but then somebody innocent accidentally gets blown up in the process. You have to go directly to a meeting with him and his goons, and your NPC support character Paulie has his gun jam on him, which is just contrived. Finally, Don Salieri has had enough of your failure and instead has you sit in on an attempt by different people to kill Morello. But then they fail and get themselves killed, so you have to chase Morello to the dockyards where you have to fight through so many goons. And what really pisses me off about this moment is this is scripted. You have to wait for Morello and his driver to get to the dockyard. You can't blow the car up in the meantime. I wasted all my ammo and had to go into the dockyard with no ammo. And since there was a save point once I got to the dockyard, there's no way for me to recover my ammo, which meant I had to get really creative with how I fought this. I had to run multiple people over until I got enough ammo together that I could reasonably fight. And then I died multiple times because this is the absolute apex of levels that are overly open and have people shooting at you from multiple directions that you would have no way to have seen. Eventually, I managed to get enough ammo together and figure out the puzzle of how to sneak into the warehouse, kill Sergio, and drive back. That was a literal hour of my life on a mission, and all for what? To kill a single person. It doesn't normally take an hour, but I was getting frustrated by the end for how long it was taking, so I was breaking traffic laws, which meant the cops were chasing after me, and that only prolonged the mission. This is a 4-part mission where, except for the last chunk, You have to drive to every single location, making this mission unforgivably padded. But quite frankly, most of the missions are unforgivably padded, it's just that this is the worst example. Especially because every segment of this level is separated by a loading screen, on top of the in-game loading screens, such as whenever you have to exit the city, or whenever you go to the third island, because apparently they couldn't figure out how to load the city in dynamically. So the biggest part of the city had to be put behind a loading screen, and the loading times in this game, on the PS2 at least, are unforgivably long. I got so impatient by the end, I was turbocharging my emulator just to get through the loading screen slightly quicker. This is one of those games that's about twice as long as it needs to be, and even before it wears out its welcome, it's still not very good. I wasn't happy when I beat the game, I felt myself more in weary resignation, but part of that has to do with how atrocious the final level is. It's the most egregious combat segment possibly in the entire game. Very little cover, 2 or 3 dozen guys you have to fight where only a single one in the right spot can pretty much kill you instantly. I think only one first aid pack that only gives you back 50% of your health, and a boss fight with a guy who can kill you from a mile away. If I had to redo this every time I died, I don't think I would have ever beaten the game. And it's a really good ending for what it's worth, showing that the framing device of Tommy talking to a detective was entirely the result of Salieri betraying Tommy and Tommy negotiating for a reduced prison sentence in exchange for testimony.
They won't be able to take revenge on me. At least not as easily as if they were free. I am willing to give evidence against them if you ensure our protection, and after the trial, a new identity for me, my wife, and my daughter.
And then after his prison sentence, he goes into witness protection, but despite everything, Tommy is tracked down by the Mafia and ultimately killed in his own front yard.
You know, the world isn't run by the laws written on paper. It's run by people. Some according to laws, others not. It depends on each individual how his world will be, how he makes it. And you also need a whole lot of luck, so that somebody else doesn't make your life hell.
You know what's funny? I remember in the early days of 10 for the Win on Machinima, Steven Larson named this one of the 10 best sandbox games ever made. Which is funny. It's not a good sandbox game. In fact, it's barely a sandbox game to begin with. It's not even top 10 for its day. And I think that while it may have been novel at the time, it has not aged well at all. Aside from the driving, everything in this game feels weak and amateurish, but with that said, however, there is a Mafia Definitive Edition that came out in 2020, and it's a full-on ground-up remake of the game with modern game mechanics, and if you want to experience the game, I highly recommend it. I only played it for a little while, but it fixes every single one of my issues. It even lets you skip all optional driving. As for the original version, avoid it like the plague. It's one of the lesser sandbox games I've ever played. So let me be perfectly clear here. I'm a big fan of the Saints Row series. I didn't get around to playing the series until about 2011 or 2012 when I got the special edition of Saints Row III, which came with a free digital copy of Saints Row 2. And I enjoy the series whether it's 2, 3, or 4. And there are no other games. Nah, I'm just kidding. There's Gat Out of Hell. Either way, from Saints Row 2 onward, this is a series that is considered to have its own unique identity as a quirky and anarchic crime sandbox series with a lot of fun side activities. Or so I've heard. I was always told that Saints Row 1 was more or less played fairly straight and as a result was compared relatively consistently to GTA. But Saints Row 1 is an Xbox 360 exclusive and therefore a lot fewer people played it than any other game in the series, so up until now I've just been taking people's word for it. And that's why it's here today, because I want to see for myself how much it takes after GTA, because I've learned not to take people's word for anything. And I'd also like to use this as an excuse to play through the game, because it's the only Saints Row game I've never actually played all the way through until now. Note, the only one that counts. Now, I tried playing this on vanilla caffeine-free Xenia, but much like me when I was 12, it had a really bad stuttering issue. Thankfully, Xenia Canary once again came in with the clutch. It still has occasional stuttering and a few other minor issues, but nothing that ruins the experience, but I apologize for any negative viewer experience that this may cause. So despite the ridiculous places this series would go, it actually has very humble beginnings, with our protagonist simply walking down the street and accidentally getting caught in the middle of a gang fight. He was going to be killed for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, but Julius, the leader of the 3rd Street Saints, saves you and offers you a position in the gang, and from there, the structure is very similar to Saints Row 2, if you've played it. You go through and do a series of missions centered around taking out one of the city's gangs, and usually the story paths are centered around one or two of the major recurring NPCs in your gang. You have the Vice Kings, who have an in with the police and are primarily operating legitimate businesses while doing illegal stuff on the side, which the police help bury. This is a mission path done through your friend and mine, Johnny Gat. Then you have the Los Carnalas, a vicious Latino gang which operates a fairly standard crime empire with drugs and illegal weapons. The contact in this case is this guy Troy, who seems weirdly apprehensive about the whole thing. Then you have the West Side Rollers, who are a gang of illegal street racers who also deal in illegal car tuning and stolen car parts. This is a mission string done through your contact Lynn, and oh man, it's a shame this game is as old and low res as it is. And it's funny, seeing as some of these characters show up in later games, but not all of them, I was just waiting to see the inevitable downfall of the characters who didn't show up, in particular Lynn. My first question about this game would be, how straight is it playing things actually? Things were definitely more grounded in this area. You know, you're not throwing people in the meat grinder for getting close to a celebrity in this game, for example, but I also have a hard time describing a lot of these characters as playing it completely straight. Like, look at these characters who we encounter during some of the side missions.
So, what can I do for you? Were you in a car accident, walking accident, coffee accident, self-inflicted stab wound accident? Your injuries are worth money to both of us.
Then there's Johnny Gat, who pretty much has the same personality as he does in later games. Smarmy and overconfident, yet charming.
So you're Julius's new boy, huh? You don't look like much. Then again, I don't look like I have an 8-inch cock, so I guess we're both full of surprises.
Are these people attempting to be wacky, or do they just have larger-than-life personalities? I don't know. But even if everything isn't completely taking itself seriously, it's still taking itself a lot more seriously than later games. Like how despite this one Latino gang leader's relationship with his wife being a running joke, he straight up beats her at one point, which I was shocked by. Even though this is not uncommon in real life, it's still shocking to see it, and see it presented in such a grounded and unflinchingly realistic way. Either way, I think that all the characters are well-rounded and charming with pretty damn good vocal performances, especially Julius. That dude could charm your pants off just with his voice.
Let's get down to business. If we're serious about taking back the road, we gotta let those motherfuckers know what time it is. Now you break it down, and it's all about respect. Get enough of it, they're gonna back off, and we're gonna move right on in.
The unfortunate exception to this is the player character, who is a mostly silent protagonist. I say mostly silent because he spends almost every single mission completely silent. However, he's like Ferb from Phineas and Ferb, where he speaks exactly once per episode, or in this case, once per mission string. He'll just say the most random and innocuous thing in the final mission of every mission string.
I'm gonna skull fuck that bitch.
Hope you don't mind hepatitis. What?
Which isn't ideal, especially when you have so many well-rounded characters acting in your vicinity. It creates the same issue that GTA 3 had, where you're a passive character in your own story. It just sticks out like a sore thumb. As a matter of fact, that combined with the fact that there are no land vehicles other than cars also gives this the impression of being a very GTA 3-esque game. I'm not sure if the once-in-a-blue-moon speech was meant as sort of a running joke, and if so, they sacrificed the player character's entire personality on that altar. And the later games show just how much better the story can be when you have a main character who's able to be more active in these cutscenes. Overall, though, I think the game has pretty superb storytelling. There's this lingering through line of the honorable gang members either being disenfranchised with their gangs or just attempting to make peace, while the more ruthless people who work against them suffer, which presents sort of a grounded humanity that you don't often see in games based around warring gang members. My favorite is probably Benjamin King, who's an old friend of Julius, so despite them being in the middle of a war, Julius still has you rescue King when things come crashing down. Much like Saints Row 2, it starts out as a bunch of individual stories with only a loose connection between them, and each specific mission is carried by a solid script and the aforementioned good voice acting, but then that loose connection gets paid off in the end. And this results in potentially my favorite ending in the series. Having played Saints Row 2, I knew that there was some sort of boat explosion at the end of the first game, but the way it's presented is so intriguing. As it turns out, Troy, one of the highest ranking members of the gang, was actually an undercover cop. And we know from audio logs that he was working with Julius to try and dismantle the Saints from within, but the way it's presented makes me believe that Julius and Troy were essentially using the player character to destroy all the gangs in Stillwater, then promote him to second in command, pin every single thing the Saints did on him, then blow him up on the yacht so that all gang life in Stillwater is officially over. The player who would have taken the fall dies, and everyone else walks free. That kind of blew my mind. I knew that the boat explosion was significant, but I never knew it was that significant. One of those cases where it gets more interesting the more I think about it. So yeah, I was pleasantly surprised by the story. How does the game play though? Well, you start out making your own custom character like always, and when it comes to the character creation, I want to try to make my usual Saints Row character. A swaggering black guy with a Cat Williams haircut, a Cockney accent, and a three-piece red and black pinstripe suit. Unfortunately, since there's no voice in this game, there's no Cockney accent, and with that said, there's also very limited clothing options, so I couldn't complete the effect. So I just decided to get a little bit wacky and make a character that's similar but legally distinct. And also at some point during character creation, I decided to give him the chin of Charles V. That way, when you look at him in profile, he looks like a crescent moon. I mean, his face gets blown to Kingdom Come, which establishes why he looks different in Saints Row 2, so I'll just say it's the same guy. Once you get into the game, the structure is very similar to Saints Row 2, as I said. Basically, you have to play the mini-games to earn respect to be able to play the main missions. Which is a good setup, because it basically forces you to interact with the gameplay that you would otherwise probably not want to interact with. Surprisingly as well, insurance fraud is in this game. I assumed given the fact that it was a wacky side mission that it wouldn't have been included here, but I'm glad it was because it's universally my favorite minigame. If you're not familiar, insurance fraud is a recurring side activity where you have to jump into traffic and do as much damage to yourself as possible. It's tougher here for reasons I'll get into in a bit, but the essence is still the same. Plus, there's one chunk of the insurance fraud missions that will sometimes let you play on the highway, and my god, there is nothing more satisfying in this game than watching yourself get creamed by an 18-wheeler. And it all leads to the missions, and despite the lack of vehicle variety, you have a good set of missions here. Driving, shooting, chasing and shooting, etc. It's all there and it's all fun. The shooting is relatively easy mechanically, but they're always throwing enough people at you that there's always a decent challenge. Then the vehicle physics are great. Super arcadey and quick, but tight as hell. It's like you're super glued to the ground for how tight the controls are. You do recover your health relatively slowly, but that's usually not an issue assuming you can find some cover. But you can't always, and at that point it's just a matter of your own skill. So you have a good mechanical setup and a series of missions that utilizes it well. The missions aren't perfect, of course. There was one point where I was playing a mission where I was supposed to chase some stolen cars, and I had this one car dead to rights, only for it to no-clip through a wall and get away. And generally speaking, there were occasionally missions that required a little bit too much from you. But once things got going and I was making substantial progress on missions that relied entirely on my own skill and nothing else, I was enjoying myself. And I say this to preface the fact that I have about 100 small nitpicks with this game. Yeah, despite all my positivity so far, there's a lot of little annoyances that come with this being the first entry in a long-running series. Like how the missions don't have checkpoints. There's one mission in particular at the end of the Los Carnales mission string where you have to blow up a plane, but while you're in the gunner seat, your companion who's driving is one of the worst drivers in history, constantly running into walls or getting himself stuck. Meanwhile, there's a ton of enemies with rocket launchers all around, and these guys have split-second reaction time. So the moment they get within range, you're basically guaranteed to take a buttload of damage. I had to do this mission something like 20 times because the bad driver combined with the sudden appearance of the rocket launcher wielding thugs that were hard to shoot and only a few explosions worth of health, it's basically trial and error. You need to play it over and over until you can get a pretty much perfect run, and it wouldn't be so bad if I didn't need to make that tedious commute from the other end of the city to the airport every single time I redid this mission. Even certain old school sandboxes let you skip the commute once you were redoing missions. This sucks.
This sucks. I am so unhappy.
And the funny thing is, if you're using the rocket launcher yourself, the explosion radius is pitiful. There are countless times where I used it, and there were people who should have been caught in the explosion but simply weren't. Plus, there's also ammo issues. In most games, if an enemy has a different gun of the same type, you can pick up the ammo without picking up the gun. But for some reason in this game, you need to have the exact type of gun to pick up the ammo. This is really annoying because it means you either have to put up with constantly running out of ammo, or you have to keep swapping to inferior weapons, basically making the ability to buy weapons useless. Optionally, you can just stock up on ammo from the weapon shops, but there's two problems with this. One, you don't get very much money from just playing, certainly not enough to max out on ammo at any given time, so it feels like I had to ration my money if I wanted to use the guns of my choice. Of course, you can collect money from your safe house, but you start the game with one safe house and end it with like 4. So you have to go out of your way to visit your safe house to collect the money, and even then it's not that much. Then 2, they made the baffling decision to have shops close down at night. Sure, it gives you an opportunity to do a mildly entertaining robbery mission, but that's not enough. This is a game where the shops are all closed for a third of the time, but in case you haven't noticed, this game doesn't stop during that time. It's not bully. You still need to buy stuff at night, and there's no clear way to move the clock forward from what I could find just playing the game. There may be a way, I just never discovered it. So you either need to go without, or wait around for minutes on end for shops to open. Realistic? Yes. Convenient? Hell no. Plus, then there's also the issue with the respect. In Saints Row 2, there were a lot of ridiculous fun minigames to earn respect with, and it is maybe a bit churlish to complain that very few of my favorite side activities other than insurance fraud and mayhem are here, but it also doesn't help that the minigames that are here feel so unrefined. Like how it'll be a recurring issue in both mayhem and insurance fraud that cars will simply not spawn, giving you nothing to earn points with. Also, in later missions of Mayhem, you usually get bonuses for specific weapons, destroying specific things, or killing specific people, but the RNG is pants. Sometimes you'll get a good roll of the dice and be able to get bonuses for killing civilians with a rocket launcher, but other times you'll get bonuses for using the pistol and destroying cars that only spawn 1 out of every 100 times. A combination that is never fun. I would love to be able to back out of the mission to try again, but there's no way to do that, so your only recourse is either to die or reload. And the funny thing is, while there's no checkpoints in story missions, at least you can restart them from the menu. If you fail a minigame, there's no way to restart it. You have to traipse all the way back to where the minigame is, which is 9 levels of tedious. And you better hope that if you die, that spawn point is near where the minigame activator is. Oh, and if you get bonuses for thrown weapons, you might as well restart regardless of how inconvenient it is, because thrown items are worthless in this game. They have a worse explosion range than the rocket launcher, and on top of that are impossible to aim. If you throw it, there's practically no way to know how far it's going to go, or if it'll go remotely where you want it to go. It's ridiculous. Then there's insurance fraud, which is definitely flawed for the fact that if you don't hit the ragdoll button before getting hit by a car, then you might as well have been a ghost doing ghostly backflips for all the good it did to your overall score. And I don't know why. Plus, rather than giving you bonuses for taking dives in the circle, in this game, the circles are the only places where you can get points. So if you happen to get an absolutely brutal, bone-liquefying crash that would normally give you 100,000 points, but you did it 2 inches outside of the circle, tough shit. The rest of these minigames are fine but fairly bland. However, the amount of respect you get for playing these minigames is a pittance. In Saints Row 2, you could play what? 3 or 4 minigames to completion and have enough respect to play through the entire game? Well, in this game, playing through an entire minigame string to completion will give you like 4 respect points. So you need to play something like 9 or 10 different minigames all the way through in a game that has 5 or 6 good ones. You can alleviate this somewhat by dressing up in expensive clothing and getting your face pierced to hell, which increases your respect earned to a certain degree, but look at this. I had to make my character look like even more of an idiot just to get something like 20% extra respect.
What's wrong with your face?
And on top of that, the clothing options in this game are extremely limited. It's just a series of minor inconveniences that are pretty unfortunate because the game I loved is here. It's just buried under so many layers of unrefinement. It's still a good game, don't get me wrong, but it's the type of game that can be described by death by 1,000 needles. Except it's not death by 1,000 needles, it's more just substantial pain by 1,000 needles. But I guess the question remains, does this game actually rip off GTA, or is it its own distinct thing? That's actually a tough question. Originally my gut feeling was to say no, but then I thought about it some more and I realized that maybe it does take a little bit too much inspiration from GTA to not be compared. In particular, GTA San Andreas. You have several minigames that were in some way lifted directly from that game, and honestly, the entire setup of this game very much reminds me of the gang wars aspect in GTA San Andreas, just taken to its logical conclusion. Especially the part where rival gangs will attempt to take back stolen territory. Even the aspects of the multiple gangs matches that, especially because none of them are too over the top. So it definitely feels inspired, but whether or not it's a knockoff or a ripoff is up to personal opinion, but it's also worth mentioning that this game definitely feels like a prototype of Saints Row 2. The graphics are identical, the character customization is all there just with less variety, the main structure is basically the same but with less varied missions, etc. So I think it's definitely a good game worthy of its place in history. Definitely more so than the 2022 game. Oh my god, I just remembered it. Oh god. Trying to repress that out of my mind. Ugh. But it's definitely a lesser experience than pretty much the entire rest of the series other than that 2022 abomination, if only just because every other game takes what this game builds and puts it into overdrive. I think this game is as much like GTA as it needs to be, while also attempting to at least build something that will be made into a unique style come 2008. There were probably some ideas that were taken, but they were at least striving to be different, which I appreciate. But at the end of the day, this can be best described as being a proof of concept game, and beyond viewing the historical context, you're better off just playing Saints Row 2. And while this is a more pure experience, I would say it's a lesser experience pretty much all around. A good experience, but lesser. I guess them's the breaks when you're the predecessor to one of the greatest games ever made. Alright, and that was 4 reviews for 4 GTA-like games, and I guess I'll rank them now. In last place for today, I would definitely give the wooden spoon to Mafia, cause holy crap. Then after that, I would go with True Crime Streets of LA, True Crime NYC, and finally Saints Row wins the day. Because, I mean, come on. Alright, and that's all for us today. Normally I like to cover knockoff style games in groups of 5 or 10, but in this case I'm gonna keep it to 4 because the average sandbox game is big, and as such there's a lot more to talk about for each individual game. But don't fret, this is gonna be a long series. Because there were a lot of games that aped the style of GTA during the 2000s. In fact, here's a list. The Godfather, The Godfather 2, Scarface, Mafia 2, Torrente 3, The Wheelman, The Saboteur, The Getaway Black Monday, Gangs of London, Crime Life Gang Wars, Driver 3, Driver Parallel Lines, Driver 76, Cop the Recruit, and Retro City Rampage. There are also a few more that ride that line, such as the original Just Cause, Sleeping Dogs, or the original Mercenaries, so that'll probably be up to a poll or something. But if I missed any potentially juicy examples on the list, let me know and I'll add it to the list. But that's it from me, so I'll just say what I always say. If you like this video, be sure to leave a comment telling me what you think, like this video, subscribe, and hit the notification icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing. I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Stay crispy, my friends.
You